The Short Game is listener-supported on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join us on our Discord, head to theshortgame.net or patreon.com/theshortgame. Welcome back to The Short Game. This is a show about short video games that respect your time. I'm Raygan Kelly, and I'm joined this week by one of my very cool co-hosts, plus an exciting guest,
Laura Dash, and
this is Jordan Starkweather.
And Jordan, thank you so much for coming on the show. We're talking about Game Boy games this week, and so Jordan is a perfect guest because Jordan is the host of the Pocketoid podcast, a podcast about not about short video games. That's our thing. Sorry, not your thing. You can't have that. It's
ours.
It's about
Small
pocket
things,
video,
pocket
portable video games.
Short is ours, small is his.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, short in terms of height, right? Like if you were to put them on the ground. Your games are probably shorter than many of ours.
Yeah, they are the tiniest games imaginable. I mean, DS cartridges, I think those are probably even Switch cartridges, very small.
Yeah. And also, of course, Jordan is the proprietor of the CRT Pixels Twitter account, which if you haven't spotted that, I'll have a link to it in the show notes, and we may talk about it at various points. But it's awesome. It's a great Twitter account for showing video games both on modern displays and also on the displays they were meant for. It's a really cool project that he's been doing. So thank you so much, Jordan, for joining us on the show.
Absolutely. It's good to be here. You guys are one of my favorite podcasts, so this is kind of surreal to hear you say that we are one of your favorite podcasts.
The podcasting universe is smaller than you might think, so it's a good synergy here. Let's talk about Game Boy games. I love Game Boys. So we kind of thought we'd start this episode by talking a little bit about our personal histories with the Game Boy. And Jordan, do you want to kick us off? Tell us about, Game Boys and Game Boys in your life.
Game Boys and you.
Absolutely. So the Game Boy was actually my very first video game anything. I actually have this is the one that I got. This green Game Boy Pocket was my first video game console ever. And I got it in the late 90s. And, at the time I was probably like 10 or 11, had no idea that it had already been around for, so many years. It was basically outdated and old by that point. But my friend had one and I just knew that I wanted one, and boom, I got one. And it kind of just set me, personally down the path of like getting into video games. So it's always been very important for me in that regard. But I honestly was never much of like a huge original Game Boy enthusiast. I mean, I loved Pokemon like most folks from our generation and all that. But it wasn't until I guess I got older to where something about, how do I say this? So I'm a big like design guy, like things that are well designed are just very satisfying to me. And there was a point last year where I found a Game Boy cartridge. It was a Super Mario Brothers or Super Mario Land 2. And I just held it in my hand and I was like, God, this thing is so well designed. I want more of these. This feels good to hold. And suddenly it just set me down this path of just like, I kind of just went wild over the last year collecting for the Game Boy and discovering really what an amazing community this little console has of just like modders and enthusiasts and collectors. And it's also not like a crazy expensive console to collect for. And I've always been into retro game collecting, but the market has just gone bonkers in the last decade to where it's just not even feasible anymore. But Game Boy games are still relatively affordable. You can still find tons of stuff out there for $5, $10, no problem. And so it was really fun to kind of get back into retro collecting. And it's just been in a year that's been really hard and big and scary. It's been very nice to be playing games that are small and comfortable and simple all over again. And it just kind of, I think it fits this show really well because it's like the console of short games. Most of the games for it are just a couple hours long. And so when you approached me about coming on to talk about the Game Boy, I was like, oh yeah, that makes so much sense. That sounds awesome. So,
yeah, it makes me feel a little bit silly that we never thought to cover this as sort of a general topic before. But like, yeah, I've had a pretty long history with the Game Boy too. It was not my first console. My first console was actually the Game Gear, and I was a Sega kid. And so having a Game Boy was something that didn't really happen in my life until, I don't know, whenever Pokemon was pretty big. So like, and that was really late in the Game Boy's life. But like before that, I wouldn't have been caught dead with a Game Boy because I thought those were, that all Nintendo was for babies. But actually, when I was thinking back on it, I was like,
it is. Let's be honest.
Of course, it really it's called the Game Boy for little boys.
That's why I love it. Actually, hold on. Do you know why it was called the Game Boy? Can I give you a piece of trivia?
Please.
I do, but but you're the guest.
So it was okay. All right. Well, I don't want to.
Well, now he's not gonna, Laura.
Now he's not gonna.
Now it's sounding like that bit in Scott Pilgrim where he's like, did you know that Pac-Man was called... That's like a running joke that we have on our show is like, did you know that Pac-Man was originally called Puck-Man in Japan? Anytime one of us brings up a stupid video game fact.
This is perfect because I only know because I know a secondary anecdote. So you tell yours first and then I'll sound smart telling mine and we'll both look good. This is how podcasts work, right?
Yeah, it's really just because the Sony Walkman was popular, I guess. And they were like, Sony Walkman, Game Boy... That's really all. That's really the story, I guess. Apparently,
those are both honestly terrible names. I've never really understood why either of them went for that, but okay.
Yeah, the story I heard was so when they needed to introduce it in America, they go to the head of marketing, and they're like, "It's called the Game Boy," and he's like, "Not a huge fan of the name because I wanted to try to introduce it to all markets. Game Boy is kind of a sexist name." He says now he said it was a sexist name. Do I think he actually said that in 1989? No way.
No. For him at the time, it was probably a dollar signs thing.
But now
right?
he's like, I thought it was sexist. But he said, if we're trying to sell it to all ages, is a bad name. And it kind of sounds Japanese. And then the people in Japan were like, cool, not changing the name. Mm-hmm. We've already printed the packaging.
It does sound very Japanese now.
So they'd already printed the name Game Boy on the plastic.
Oh,
and
yeah,
so
it's
they
on
were
the
like,
console. So
we're not changing it. It's already printed.
Mm-hmm. Tough.
I don't know. It works for some reason though. It's like
it didn't hurt it.
You kind of get the gist. Is like what I got it when I was a kid, and I didn't think. I was just like, oh, it's a little guy that plays games. Boom, like makes sense, I guess. But
so I did think it was going to be. I did think the Nintendo Game Boy was this console for babies, but I was thinking back on like my history with Game Boy games, and that actually goes a lot further back than my history with the console, because there was a time and Laura may remember this because Laura and I go back a long ways too. But there was a time in middle school where this takes a little bit of setup. My middle school was this sort of weird magnet school that had this enormous grant from Compaq, where literally every classroom had like 30 Compaq computers in it.
Whoa.
And they built the school, and Compaq was like, we are Houston. We will give you all computers, and then the middle schoolers will immediately break them.
Right. And so every room had like wall to wall, those little like Compaq all-in-ones that were running, I think, Windows 3.1. They may have upgraded them to like 95 while I was there or something like that. But so I really wanted to play games on these things, but they were kind of locked down. And so I just sort of made it, and a few other very nerdy kids who I think didn't want to go to the lunchroom to get picked on, made it our hobby to like stay in the classrooms during lunch and try and figure out how to like break these computers in order to run games on them.
Yeah.
And I don't remember.
And teachers were like, great.
Yeah.
We love this.
We had some teachers who seemed totally cool with this. And so the thing that I remember about this was that I figured out that you could turn off the security features by booting the computer with a DOS boot disk. So I had to bring in a DOS floppy from home. I had a Mac, so getting the DOS floppy was a whole story on its own. And then going in and deleting the like security program and then booting it back to Windows, and then it was fine. But I needed to be able to like set it back to normal before the teachers saw it. So doing that took almost a whole lunch break. What I really wanted was to be able to play games on this thing, but I needed to be able to reset the computer back to totally being normal again before the end of my lunch break. And the way I figured out to do that was I couldn't download games on it. It took too long. And you couldn't download the games with the security turned on, but I could turn the security off, install a Game Boy emulator. It was the only emulator that would run. I could not run NES emulators on these things. They were too slow. but installed a Game Boy emulator, and then
Do you remember which emulator it was?
I wish I did. I don't, man.
The reason I ask is because I downloaded it in the 90s, a Game Boy emulator, not knowing what I was doing, just trying to find a Mario game online. And it was called, I think it was called No Money GB or something. I don't remember.
That's
it was weird, but
probably it, honestly. I don't know.
Curious, yeah.
Whatever would have been like the reasonably decent Game Boy emulator for Nintendo 3.1, for Windows 3.1. And so, but like that meant that I could turn off the security and install the emulator, but then turn the security back on and still download ROMs like that. Those weren't blocked. EXEs were blocked, but Game Boy ROMs were not.
That makes
Correction.
sense.
EXEs you could download if you deleted the file extension, saved it, and then afterwards opened Windows File Explorer and added EXE back in.
Oh, you had hacks that I didn't have, Laura.
That was my hack.
Damn, you know your shit. Yeah, so
I knew my shit in middle school, and now I'm incapable.
Yeah. So
also the program that you could update links to open up the CD drive. That was also a key one.
ooh, yeah.
This is why kids need computers now. You can't just give them phones. And this stuff.
There's no way that a
Breaking the
kid
law.
can like, honestly, like I credit a huge amount of my like enthusiasm for like messing around with technology to spending an inordinate amount of time trying to figure out how to run games on my lunch break. And it was huge. And
Not on a computer where there'd be any repercussions from your parents.
Oh yeah, exactly. And where if I broke it, I could just pretend it wasn't me. Like I don't know who did this. We're going to talk about specific games that we are into or that we recommend a little later in the show. But I was going to say that the game that I most remember from this running on these, probably 386s or whatever during my lunch break, was, oh geez, dang. Jordan, we were just talking about this game, the one with the ghost that's very expensive now. Spirit.
Avenging Spirit.
Avenging Spirit. Thank you. That was the game that I remember playing the most back at that time. And now it's crazy expensive and I can't get a copy.
Yeah. That was one of the ones I was really excited to buy for my collection, and I didn't realize it was rare because I had just I'd only ever played it on emulators. And then I was like, oh yeah, I should grab Avenging Spirit. That game's great. And I looked it up and I was like, $400? What?
That just makes me mad.
I don't know. Yeah.
But that game,
And now
even the Japanese
all
version's expensive.
Silicon Valley startups have beautiful arcade cabinets because it's all ROMs. Well, for once, I have the first exposure to a console. This has never happened to me before, but
Nice.
My older brother, who's 8 years older than me, was given a Game Boy because we were moving from California to Texas and driving the whole way, and they needed to give him something to not murder his little sisters. So he got a Game Boy. We learned all the state capitals. Yeah.
Classic.
But, when you're like 5, that's entertaining. So he got tired of this. It was the only console he was allowed to have because my parents didn't believe in video games, but they believed in car trips. And that was how you got through car trips. So we could play the Game Boy unlimited in the car, but that was the only time. Or we could play them in set times when they would give it to
Got
us.
it.
So the thing was, he got tired of the Game Boy, gave it to me. So he gives me this Game Boy, and it's the original one, and the back panel, where the batteries are held on, is missing, and so it's just bunch of duct tape over
Classic.
the batteries.
Yeah.
So it's batteries and the duct tape, and I get 3 cartridges. I get Tetris, I get R-Type, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Fall of the Foot Clan.
It's honestly a pretty dope collection, TBH.
I
if
played
you're gonna have
those
3
3.
cartridges.
Up until Pokemon was released, and I got a new game.
Oh, wow.
So that's all I played. I got very
That's
good
really
at Tetris. I speed run Fall of the Foot Clan, not knowing that was a thing. I just knew every pizza. I knew every sewer trap. I knew every shortcut to beat the boss. I just aced that game because I had to play it. And eventually almost beat R-Type, but that game was so hard I don't think I ever actually beat it.
You know,
but
I think I was going to say that's the real odd man out of those three. Like the first two are, Fall of the Foot Clan was like
right?
super popular. Like everybody bought that for their kid because everybody loved turtles. I love turtles. Damn, I love turtles. By the way, total sidebar, but did you guys see like there's that new Turtles beat 'em up game coming out?
God.
I think it's Treasure or something.
I've got a couple Twitter friends.
What's the word? Anyway, it doesn't matter.
It's tribute.
Tribute. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, I got a couple Twitter friends working on that, and I'm very excited for it.
Man, very excited.
It looks fantastic.
But yeah, R-Type is a real like outlier there. Do you have any idea? Like, was your brother into shooters or like?
No, I think he probably played it once at an arcade and asked for it, and then never played it again because it was definitely the one cartridge. You have the little case with all the slots, and of course it was sad because you have like 16 slots and we had 3 cartridges.
That's the worst.
R-Type was always in the last slot, the shame slot. That you like bought it and you don't think you're ever going to play it.
Yeah,
and that's where R-Type lived, and it was just because it's so hard, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a hard shooter, but I always thought that. I mean, I'm sure you can. I don't know if you're going to tell us a little bit about like R-Type, but like I love that arcade game. I've never played the Game Boy port, but it's
very good.
Yeah, I really love that game, and it's surprising that they even really were able to cut it down to the Game Boy. It's a pretty big game and lots of like I forget how many levels, but there's a pretty large number of levels. And on the TurboGrafx, they actually released it on 2 cartridges because it was too big for a single cartridge.
I just read an article on the like D port of this basically because it's almost like they retroized it to work on the Game Boy. They did cut a couple levels. They did have a different company do it, and I think the big thing they were trying to do is just to keep like it says credits, like it includes a lot of the arcade feel to it. I remember being thrown by that because I was like, credits? You mean lives? No, they mean credits. It's just the arcade game.
Wow, that's cool. If you're ever looking to pick it up now, I highly recommend grabbing R-Type DX for the Game Boy Color because it actually has all 4 versions. It has like R-Type 1 and 2, the original Game Boy versions, and then it has Game Boy Color versions of those as well. And you can find it for like $5.
That's incredible.
For some reason, R-Type it sold really well on the Game Boy. A lot of people bought R-Type and R-Type DX. I don't know why, but it's really common.
It seemed to be really common, and then people would get it and be like, "Oh, wait, this is incredibly hard."
Yep.
Well,
so
sorry, Laura.
Enjoy playing that first level for several years because you're 6.
I think I made a joke on Twitter because there was that video going around of that lady trying to play the Lion King. Did you guys see this on Twitter? She's like a streamer and she's trying to play the Lion King for the first time, and she's like, and she dies and it says game over, and she's like, wait. Game over. It's like she had no idea like the game was like done. And so it was really funny. And so I retweeted that and was like, y'all think us retro gamers are just playing the same games over and over. I haven't gotten past level 2 in R-Type 3 in 20 years.
That was pretty much me. And so much later, Pokemon comes out and I'm amazed it runs on, I'm still using the same Game Boy.
It's wild.
And 2, I have never played a game designed to be longer than like 40 Turtles is like a 50-minute game. And I'm playing Pokemon and I'm like, there's more game?
You don't just pick your starter and then end the game and then pick your starter again?
Like, I am flabbergasted when Pokemon comes out. I was like, there's a story? There's more game after 2 hours? And I was talking to Raygan about this because I wanted to trade, and I just like, there's so much game, and he was like, okay.
So thinking about it more, I guess I did kind of glance over that part of my Game Boy experience because like once Pokemon hit, I was in deep into that, and like it really did give the console kind of a second life.
Oh yeah, totally.
But like. I guess, but for me that because I was really into Pokemon. I think I got it into like 99, and then you had the Game Boy Color that was already out at that point, and then you had the Game Boy Advance like 2 years later. So for me, it was more like I got super into the Game Boy Advance and then super into the DS. So much so that I started a whole podcast about it for like 10 years. But like, yeah, it was just weird how I don't know. In the 90s, I didn't play much Game Boy, but yeah, it's like the Pokemon kind of gave it like this second life there late in the 90s and into the early 2000s, which is wild for such an old piece of hardware.
Yeah, it was already super, super long in the tooth. And I forget, was the Game Boy Color already out when Pokemon came out, or did it come out right after? It was right around the same time.
It came out after.
I get confused. Yeah, I think it came out. I think it came out just like a year later or something.
But it was sort of like, it seems like Nintendo was like very much like about to abandon the Game Boy, and then Pokemon comes along and everyone is buying new Game Boys again.
Yeah, so I looked at some of the weird stuff that went around the Pokemon launch because I was interested, and apparently they got the Volkswagen Beetle, the new one, had just come out. So they paired up with Volkswagen to get yellow Beetles that they would transform into Pikachu. And then they had
I remember
they renamed the town of Topeka, Kansas into Topekachu.
Oh no.
And they had people parachute out of a plane dressed like Pikachu and then land and get into the Volkswagen, which were painted like Pikachu, and drive to the drive around the US promoting.
So I'm in Missouri, so Kansas is next door to us, and I remember exactly what you're describing being on the news and being like, God, I wish that happened here, man. That sounds so rad.
This was all before YouTube. Like, the local news is the only way you find out about publicity.
I can't get over Pikachu. That's really good.
It's also where Westboro Baptist Church is, if you're curious.
Oh, God. True. Oh, no.
They're Topekachu and Westboro, the two things Topeka is.
Oh. I mean, I'm trying to think of any Pokemon pun I can do with Houston, Texas, and there's nothing. So I guess they did it in the right spot despite the terrible church. Well, we could probably reminisce more about our history with the Game Boy, and I'm sure that'll continue to come up as we go along. Because, like, damn, I love the game. By the way, point of order: we're not talking about the Game Boy Advance here. We're not talking about the entire Game Boy series. I could do another whole dozen episodes about the Game Boy Advance. I was very obsessed with the Game Boy Advance. But yeah, the Game Boy itself. The only thing I really strongly remember about picking up the Game Boy was that I actually got my physical Game Boy. And bought Pokemon, and I loved Pokemon. I played a ton of it, and I was like, I need more games for this thing. And because I was so excited about Pokemon, I was like, okay, I need to see if there are other RPGs for this system. I really wanted to play more RPGs on it. And because it was when it was, like, I don't actually know what year this was, but whatever year Pokemon came out, or maybe the year after, there was no way to look this stuff up or get a good critical consensus or whatever. So my
find
option,
a GeoCities site.
I know. My option was literally just okay, go into the local game store and ask the guy behind the counter, what are some good RPGs for the Game Boy? And he kind of shrugged and was like, and he sold me, I think there was, Final Fantasy Legend and Revelations Demon Slayer.
Holy, that's a rare one today too, I believe.
Yeah,
that's actually a Shin Megami Tensei game.
I know. So, and the thing is, I love the Shin Megami Tensei series today, and but I remember putting that game in my Game Boy. First of all, it's one of those Game Boy Color / Game Boy games. It doesn't actually look very good on a Game Boy Pocket. No. It's kind of hard to play. But I was completely confused by it, to the point where I was like, maybe I don't actually like this type of game at all. Maybe I don't actually like RPGs after all. This game was so inscrutable. I remember you start in a town and you leave that town, and then maybe you can't get back into the town again afterwards, and then I couldn't find where to go next, and I just ended up wandering around the desert until I died. The end. And that's my story. Right. Yeah. So the Game Boy had high highs and low lows.
So what your story could have been, if you'd gotten the right guy, is he could have directed you towards the Dragon Quest 1 and 2 cartridge, or Dragon Quest 3, as I got directed to, and Dragon Quest became my favorite series of all time. So he should have given you Dragon Quest, is what I'm saying.
I never played a Dragon Quest until the most recent one.
Oh yeah.
I don't know, before we get into talking about specific games, in general, I guess RPGs were kind of a big part of what I was wanted to play RPGs on the Game Boy, but I think what I actually ended up playing most, apart from Pokemon, was just puzzle games like Tetris. Did you have any particular genres you particularly liked on the Game Boy?
Well, when I traded, when I was able to borrow games from other people, I always asked for Kirby games, and then I would play the Mario games, which were just ports. But the Kirby ones were the ones that I always wanted. Eventually, I really wanted to play all the pinball games, but they had rumble packs, and they would cause, like, if the batteries got jostled loose, then the game would reset. So I had to always disable the rumble packs, which is not great. So also, if I got too excited when playing, it would just and restart the game. So RPGs, saving often, and not playing anything with the rumble pack was how I got through. But Kirby, number one game, I think, when I traded. Anybody had Kirby, I would trade, any sandwich, any lunch for the week would go to borrowing the Kirby game.
That's
Again,
really funny,
sorry, Mom. She's hearing about hacking and like me not eating lunch.
It's really funny you say that, because actually I never owned any. Well, no, that's not entirely true. How to explain this? So I never really owned any Kirby games either. I would just trade my friends for them, just like you did.
Yeah.
So one of my best friends growing up was actually from Japan, and he had a ton of just Japanese games, and he had a ton of Japanese Game Boy games, which is awesome because the Game Boy is backwards compatible. Or not backwards compatible, but not region locked. And so I would just, borrow a ton of games from him. And, I learned a lot about different series and different games that I never would have learned about otherwise. But so yeah, it's like, it was just, I would always grab like Kirby Star Stacker from him, which is a puzzle game, kind of like Tetris, or I'd grab like Kirby's Block Ball, which is freaking awesome and still one of my favorite games on the whole console. But I'm trying to think. I think I always, like you said, Raygan, always wanted more RPGs. But yeah, the selection was just kind of, there actually were a ton in Japan. We just didn't get a lot of them. Like there's a whole
They weren't localized necessarily.
Yeah. There's a whole series called the Oni series in Japan. I think there's like 5 of them, and they're like ninja themed RPGs that we never got. There's a whole bunch of them over there that we never got. So I wish that we'd gotten more of them, but what's funny about, you mentioned the Final Fantasy Legend games earlier. I grabbed Final Fantasy Legend 2 and Adventure right around that same time. And I think a lot of people did right around the Pokemon craze, because Sunsoft, the publisher, they saw the Pokemon craze and they actually went to Squaresoft and then re-released the Final Fantasy Legend games, which hadn't been available since like the 90s, because they basically saw, oh, these kids are looking for RPGs. And that's the reason why those games aren't that expensive today, because they sold really well. The Sunsoft copies did right around the time Pokemon came out. So yeah, I was always looking for RPGs, but now I think nowadays my favorite games for the console are like platformers, especially like hidden gem platformers, or like ones that you just don't expect. Like there's like anything with Sunsoft in the title, or like I don't know, just like even like Looney Tunes for the Game Boy is really good. There's like Mickey's Dangerous Chase for the Game Boy is like a freaking great game made by Capcom. And so I love, like the Game Boy versions of like the DuckTales games and like Darkwing Duck are like really good versions of those games. So nowadays it's like, I'm all about the platformers. That's like my main thing. So
yeah, those are really fun. This is not exactly a totally original thought, but something I've really felt about the Game Boy library is that the ones that really do it well are the games that are not trying to have gigantic sprites on screen, because the resolution is so low. Like thinking about like the I think the Batman game from Sunsoft, there's
he's just like he's like a little guy.
Yeah, he's tiny, and you can tell it's Batman, but it's like very abstract, tiny little micropixel Batman in a style that honestly I think like if a indie was going for that style today, it would like be pretty fashionable, like a low pixel style. Whereas like some games, like I was going back and trying to replay Avenging Spirit, which is an interesting game, but like probably its biggest fault is like it has these incredibly charismatic, large, cartoony sprites, but they're so big that you can't see anything around you, And so like it's a balancing act, being able to fit. I forget how many pixels across that screen is, but it's nothing. It's tiny. So being able
I think a lot of games back then were trying to kind of go more for like the NES resolution. Like even some games that were ported from the NES, they would actually just crop in the screen. Which games like Paperboy just made them completely unplayable. But I think that like a lot of games were just trying to, I don't know, go for that same kind of NES resolution, but it wound up making the game world feel super cramped. But the ones that didn't do that, feel awesome. Like you said, like Batman. Also in that game, he has a gun, which just still cracks me up. It's just, his little sprite just has like, and every time I see it, it makes me laugh.
Yeah, it's literally just the lens on the window on the world has to be much smaller. Like you can have the tiny character, you can have the same jump size and everything. You just have to zoom in, and sometimes that works with the game. Other times it didn't change it, so you can't anticipate stuff ahead of time. So it's tricky.
Yeah, that's why the platformers are such a hugely mixed bag. Like the Game Boy is like probably the biggest chunk of the library are puzzle games, and those are hit or miss too. But like those, at least like you can generally do one of those on the low resolution screen without any trouble. There's other issues with some of them, but like the resolution problem is not a big deal.
And I think the thing that we don't take into account now, because we mostly play on emulators or like an IPS modded Game Boy or whatever, is that the screen refresh rate was so blurry. I mean, like I always keep around like some original Game Boy hardware just so I can keep in mind what they were actually supposed to look like on that hardware. But like there's a lot of games where, man, it can almost feel unplayable if the action doesn't move slow enough, because it's like if this were any faster, you wouldn't be able to tell what was going on. So yeah, I think that's where the puzzle games came in most of the time as well.
I mean, there's many reasons why Tetris was a hit on it, but one of them, I think, is that the speed of falling, like especially when it starts falling fast, that blurriness makes it feel almost uncontrollable. Like it's actually a benefit in Tetris. It's funny, the reason also I was looking up this game that Tetris was included instead of Mario as the ship was because the same American guy who was yelling about like the Game Boy being a stupid name said, if you want it to be only sold to little boys, include Mario. If you want adults to buy it, group in Tetris, and the little boys will buy Mario as an additional game.
Yeah. Yep.
But their parents will play Tetris. So like that was basically the premise there. And to me, Tetris is the quintessential Game Boy game.
Oh, of course.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Because it feels perfect.
It's incredible. It's a wonderful game. Have you ever played it with the link cable, like the 2-player version? I think that actually still holds up. It's really good.
I never actually played the Game Boy game with the link cable.
I never did multiplayer once on.
Yeah.
I only linked tabled to trade Pokemon.
Same. I think that was like, it seems like, except from what I hear from people, they're like a little older than me. It seems like a lot of people really did play multiplayer with the link cable when it was like in its prime, but everyone kind of after that was like, I just did it for Pokemon. And
everyone's cables broke.
Apparently it was like the selling point was head-to-head, like was the thing they sold the console on, which to me is actually like cuckoo. Like I've never even thought about wild. It.
Yeah, I mean, there's some advantages. If you want to have, like, I don't know if Tetris is the perfect example of this, but like that would have been the first time you would have had like a multiplayer game where you could have private information on each person's screen. Yeah, like I remember reading about I forget what it was called, some little like war game or something that was like a strategy war game type thing, not like Famicom Wars, but something. Yeah, but like, hey, Battleship, perfect example. Would have been ideal on 2 Game Boys with a link cable. Anyway,
I'm pretty sure Radar Scope had that, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I think it's I wonder if the like Virtual Console on the DS or the 3DS supports like linked versions.
Nope, I think just for the Game Boy, just for the Pokemon games, and that was it, which makes me sad. Although I will say that the Super Game Boy does support, like, if it's a fighting game or a tennis game or something, you can just plug in your game into the Super Game Boy and play it with 2 people, like holding different controllers, which is cool.
Yeah, I've seen some of that. That looks amazing. God, the Super Game Boy is another whole thing. Like, I didn't have any access to that when I was a kid because I didn't have an SNES. But like, I when I was playing some games preparing for this, I played on a few different things. I played on my Game Boy Pocket. I played on actual Game Boy Player, not Game Boy Player, the SNES one that we were just talking about. What's it called again?
Super Game Boy.
Super Game Boy. Thank you. And also on Mister, which we can. Hey, by the way, we have a whole episode talking about the Mister project coming along. But the Mister has recently implemented Super Game Boy support, where it'll do the accurate color palettes and borders and everything, and that really does add something, like it, like even for the games that support it, having the color palette, even if it's like a 4-color palette, it still It really helps on some of those games that kind of look a little bland otherwise. But yeah, that people don't think about the Super Game Boy, but it was a big part of the package at the time. Let's talk about some specific games. We each played some games this week. We each I played a couple of Game Boy games that were from my collection, and I just sort of leafed through some other stuff via ROMs. I know other folks have played some other ways, and we were just going to recommend some things that we think are worth revisiting for folks who are into short games, the short game audience, that you know, games on the Game Boy that you might want to revisit, whether you want to check them out on an actual Game Boy, or if you want to pull out your dusty 3DS and download it from the Virtual Console before they close that store down.
Or if you're a filthy criminal and you want to preserve video games by downloading them.
Yes. Yeah. Which is, you know, it's your moral
filthy
responsibility.
Criminal who believes in game preservation.
Yeah.
That's me. That's going to be my new Twitter bio.
So yeah, I played a few games, but the one I was going to recommend first is Donkey Kong 94, or people refer to this game as Donkey Kong 94. It's actually just called Donkey Kong for the Game Boy. People say 94 just to disambiguate because it came out in 1994. And you know, in conversations about what are good Game Boy games, you know, this will be in the top 5 in almost anybody's list. So
absolutely,
I'm probably not surprising anybody with that. But I definitely still wanted to recommend it. You know, and Jordan, feel free to you know, I know you've probably played it at least as much, if not more, than I have. But to kind of explain a little bit about why this Game Boy.
Well, hold on.
Yeah.
Can I just give my thoughts on it really quick?
Okay.
It's good. That's my thoughts.
Done.
Oh.
All right.
It's a good game.
Thank you, Jordan.
Wonderful. End of podcast. Let's wrap.
So there's a few things about Donkey Kong for the Game Boy that I think are particularly notable and make it really, really worth revisiting, more so than most of the Game Boy library, in my opinion. And the thing that really stands out about it is, first of all, it has the greatest early game fake out that you will ever see, because the game begins seeming like it is a straight port of Donkey Kong the arcade game. The graphics look very similar to Donkey Kong the arcade game, and the first 4 levels are sort of Game Boyified versions of the 4 stages in the Donkey Kong arcade game. You know, eagle-eyed players might notice that Mario has a few extra moves, but and I'll explain a few of those because they're really interesting. But at the start,
it almost feels like a prototype of like Mario's moveset from like Super Mario 64.
It really does. Yeah, like there's a few things that he can do that like stuck around in the Mario series and kind of became mainstays. The big one is like you can jump into a handstand, and if you're jumping out of a handstand, you get a higher jump. So you've got this sort of like risk reward because you kind of put yourself in like vulnerable. You can't move as fast while you're handstanding. And it also takes a moment to flip over into that position, but then you can do the sort of extra height super jump out of it. It's a really cool little move, and I forget what all else he has. There's several other little moves that he has that are more situational. But yeah, it feels totally different from how Mario felt on the NES and even on the SNES. He's a very, very acrobatic Mario in this game. But it starts with those first 4 levels that are really, really similar to the arcade game. And then it immediately, like, rather than looping and doing those same 4 levels again, like the arcade game would, and, you know, looping and looping again, it then switches to this mode where it becomes basically an action puzzle game. And there are many zones or sort of like stages or what have you that have different themes. There's like a big city theme and a jungle theme area and so on. And each of those is made up of like 6 or 8 different little mini puzzle levels. They'll have a variety of different little enemies rolling around in them. Similar to the arcade game, there's these little items you can pick up on your way to try and save Pauline. But Pauline isn't at the top with Donkey Kong of every single one of these levels, unlike the first 4. He's kind of like in as a mid-boss and then a final boss of each zone. And in between, it's more just sort of these sort of puzzle levels. And every single zone, it introduces a new mechanic, and it does a really great job of introducing them to each zone. Starts with a little sort of cutscene where, for example, maybe you see Donkey Kong pull a lever to retract a bridge, and then Mario runs along after him and pulls a different lever to extend that bridge again, and then continue the pursuit. Right, and that has taught you in 10 seconds that, like, okay, now I need to know how these retractable bridges work for the next levels. It's great. It's a really, really solid game. The level design is great. Mario feels great to control. I played it on, in this particular case, I started it on the Game Boy Pocket, and it plays okay on the Game Boy Pocket. But like Jordan was mentioning earlier, like the screens on those original Game Boys and the Game Boy Pocket was better than the original Game Boy, but like even the Game Boy Pocket, like, I had to sit at like a very precise angle, and I've played this thing, I've had this Game Boy Pocket for many years. But like, and so I'm kind of used to that, but like, even so, after a few levels, I got really tired of it. And so I switched to playing on the Mister on a CRT, which is really great because if you do play on something that has the Super Game Boy support, it does a nice frame that looks like a Donkey Kong cabinet. And it has nice like color graphics. Anyway. It
also adds in, it uses the SNES sound chip too on the Super Game Boy to add in some extra sound effects and things, which is really interesting.
Yeah. I don't know how many other games did that. It's literally just like Pauline's low bitrate voice sample saying like help instead of like a 3-note squeak to do the same thing. But it's a really great game, and it's an example of like how Nintendo was, it was definitely a showpiece for the Super Game Boy at the time. I think it was one of the first Super Game Boy compatible games, and it's one of those things where like Miyamoto was clearly definitely directly involved in it. Nintendo always does this. So they'll introduce a new piece of hardware, and they've got like their big tentpole series, Mario or something else, to like come in and tell you why that product is so exciting. And this game in particular feels like that for the Super Game Boy. But like, yeah, even on a regular Game Boy, or if you happen to pick it up on Virtual Console for the 3DS or on an emulator or something, it's still really, really worth playing because it is not a Mario game and it is not a Donkey Kong game. It's this other thing. It has a bit of a legacy. There is a series called like the Mario Minis or like Minis.
Mario and Donkey Kong.
Yeah, the Mario and Donkey Kong series, which is kind of an extension of the same sort of like action puzzle game style. I've tried playing some of those. There's one on 3DS, and I think there's one on Game Boy Advance. I forget what all. I never really liked any of those. But the original Donkey Kong 94 is all killer. So totally recommend checking it out.
I was actually surprised to see you pick that one for the short game, but I thought because to me it feels like one of the Game Boy's like more massive games. But you guys just cut off as like 10 hours or something, right?
Yeah,
I was like,
no question. You can beat it.
It probably is like,
I didn't beat it for this week for the show. I have beat it before, I'm pretty sure, but it's been many years. I don't actually know exactly how long that is. I'd have to go look up how many like stages or whatever there are, but it's very breezy. You're not going to sit there being stuck for very long, and it's very, very generous with lives. I'd be surprised if it took more than 10 hours to beat. I think it's probably more like 6.
Hey, you're probably right.
So, in contrast, I'm going to talk about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Hell yeah!
Because it's interesting. Like, even if you've played a lot of arcade beat 'em up cabinets, the Game Boy games are unique because they are slow. It is funny because like you basically have katana, you have all your different weapons, but like the kills have to happen in one hit, and the enemies have to come at a certain pace. But they have volume and they have angle basically to play at. It is fascinating now to play a beat 'em up on a Game Boy emulator. I was playing on DS, computer, however you want to play this. I'll say that there are 3 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle games, and I was playing all 3 because I couldn't remember which game I owned, and I wanted to correctly identify it. But the first 2 are about the same. They're both beat 'em ups. You get pizza that helps your life. There are half pizzas and full pizzas that are just like floating in the air on the wall. There are secret hidden areas and sewers that I somehow still remembered where they were. Like, you can go down this sewer drain, and then there's a mini game.
Man, it's amazing how that happens, man. I've got so many times where that, like, I suddenly remember like a secret I discovered when I was 10.
That's funny.
And you go through, basically, if one turtle gets beat to hell, you have to you have to get through all 4 turtles to get through all 5 stages at the end of it. So you want to talk timing, like 50 minutes if you're good.
Yep.
Yeah.
This was actually the game. So I think you're talking about Fall of the Foot Clan, right? The very first one.
Yeah, Fall of the Foot Clan, and the third apparently is a Metroidvania.
What?
Yep.
But the first,
and it's hard as hell too.
And it's
great,
super
though.
hard because I started it and was like, this is not the game I played. But the first 2 are beat 'em ups, and Fall of the Foot Clan is pure. It is just a pure beat 'em up side scroller. To the point that it's got like the highway chase, jumping over motorcycles. Like, if you name a cliche in a beat 'em up, it's in Fall of the Foot Clan.
It has another beat 'em up cliche too, which is a bomb soundtrack. It has such a good soundtrack.
Made it? Is it I think Capcom had that license, or no? Sorry, Konami. Was that a Konami? Do you know if Konami made it?
Game.
Yeah. I wonder if they did that like first party or like in house, or if they farmed out their Game Boy stuff back then.
They definitely did it in house, because I looked at the composer after I beat it for the first time last year, and she had worked on a bunch of other like really well known Capcom or Konami stuff. I can't remember who it was exactly, but she's phenomenal. Like that soundtrack is great.
This is something we didn't really talk about, but like, damn, like I love the way the Game Boy sounds. Like it has an incredible sound chip, and like, there's a real reason why when you think of chiptune music today, I think most people are thinking of things that are predominantly Game Boy chiptune. Like,
yeah, for sure.
It's an incredible system for just the way it sounds. I love it. Part of that, I'm sure, is the tools. Like, I think LSDJ has been around longer than any other like tracker of that type. But anyway, sorry, Laura, I didn't mean to interrupt. Turtles.
Oh no, I was just going to say the boss fights still really hold up. Like beating Krang, beating Shredder, they actually are still very good beat 'em up bosses where you have to do a lot of interesting jump kicks and a lot of interesting things to beat them. I thought, maybe I am very lucky that those were the games that were bought. I don't know who to thank for that. Definitely not my parents, who just guessed. But it's shocking. This game did not need to be this good. People would have bought it anyway. But there were so many bad like belt scroller beat 'em ups on the Game Boy. It's just really, and I always, when I was younger, I always assumed that Ninja Turtles was another one of those until I kept hearing people rant and rave and say, no, they're great. The Ninja Turtles Game Boy trilogy is so fun. And then I picked it up for the first time last year and just sat down on a Saturday and went through it, and I just had a great time. And I was like, boy, this is awesome. And that was actually the thing that was one of the games that really kicked off my second wind of Game Boy collecting. Because it's just, I don't know, it's just a great little game. It's like super simple and fun. Yeah, like you said, you can beat it in like 40 minutes. It's great.
Damn, I need to give that one a try now, because like I love Turtles. I love Turtles beat 'em ups.
It and the sequel, Back to the Sewers, or Back from the Sewers, they both feel just like an arcade game, but it's in your house. Like that's exactly what it feels like.
And they're just like super. Yeah, they're really simple. And like you could sit down and honestly blow through all 3 of them probably in an afternoon. But I love them all. They're great.
That makes me think about like when I was very, very young. We're talking about like I was I think when I first got my Sega Genesis, so I think I would have been somewhat in elementary school, but like probably early elementary school, I think. I don't know for sure. Anyway, I remember thinking that like beat 'em ups was like the default genre. For me, like a video game was beat 'em ups, and everything else was like a video game but different.
You were right. I'm just kidding.
It was that era, man. Like every licensed game, felt like every licensed game was a beat 'em up. If you got like a cartoon license or a movie license, you were going to do a beat 'em up. Doesn't matter if the movie was like, I don't know what, like, you know, some like peace loving thing with no violence in it. They were going to figure out some way to have those characters have to like fight their way through, you know, rough and tumble city or whatever.
Yeah.
Quick digression. Probably my favorite joke in any sitcom is Fresh Off the Boat has a joke where the lead character, Eddie, gets a copy of the Shaquille O'Neal game and hates it. And his friend, everyone's trying to get the Shaquille, and his friend was trying to get it, and his mom instead bought the 9 to 5 video game. and everyone who bought the Shaq game is miserable, and they're just so mad at the game. And then the friend keeps showing up, and he's red-eyed, and he's like, guys, this is the best game I've ever played. And at the end, they show a screenshot, and it's clearly an RPG, and they have like the do 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 playing on the chip tune.
God, I wish that existed.
And then it ends, and he stands up and he claps and he goes, "You can have it all, ladies."
God, somebody make that game.
What show was this?
It's Fresh Off the Boat.
Oh man, that's really good.
And it's one of the best running jokes. So now when I'm like, and everyone else was talking about how bad the beat 'em up was, and he was just like, guys, like he's so tired, and he's like, guys, the 9 to 5 video game.
Sounds incredible, actually. My God, has there ever been a Dolly Parton video game? Because if not, like,
yeah,
what a
I was about
loss
to say,
to humanity.
Give Dolly Parton.
I'm glad that wasn't made in the 80s, because now it will be much more respectful.
Oh, that's a very good point, actually. That's a very good point. Man, I wonder how much that license would be these days. Somebody get on that. What an idea. Yeah, Jordan, do you have a game to suggest to the short game audience?
God, I have so many. So first of all, I'm just going to knock out 2 series to begin with, which are just like, for me, like definitive Game Boy things, which is just all the Kirby games. I could just talk about all the Kirby games here. Those are like, if you have to pick up Game Boy games, just get all of those. You'll have a pinball game, a breakout game, a puzzle game, and 2 excellent platformers. Those are just 2 of my favorite series on the Game Boy. And the other one that I actually didn't think about until we were already started recording is the Game & Watch games, the Game & Watch Gallery series. I really, really adore those games, and just I've had a lot of fun sitting down and playing the Game & Watch Gallery games, because first of all, you can play them one-handed. So if you're holding a baby and bottle feeding, it helps that you just have to press A and B. But also they're just like a really simple, fun experience, and you can tell those collections were just made with a lot of love and appreciation for those, super simple little games. So the Game & Watch Gallery games are excellent too. But then the game I really want to talk about is actually one that I don't hear talked about very often, and it is by HAL Labs, the creators of Kirby, and is called Trax. At least here in the US, it's called Trax. In Japan, it's called Toy Sugeki Tank, I think is how it's essentially. Something about the title is Toy Sugeki Tank, and it basically means like go do it, junk tank. And what it is it's a game. It's a shooter actually, where you play as a little tank that can only rotate its turret in one direction, which is clockwise. And you just run through several levels. Basically, like, there's this evil empire that's come to attack this town. The town manages to overthrow one of their tanks, and now you control this tank, and you go through, I think it's 4 or 5 different levels, just blasting everything in sight and picking up power-ups. And it has this really fun, adorable little HAL Labs kind of look to it. Like, one of the bosses is a dragon helicopter, and one of the bosses is like a big mech who keeps like tripping and falling on his face. And like the final boss is like a big clown mech or something. Anyway, it's a real goofy, silly, fun game. And it's like in my top 5 Game Boy games. The first time I ever played Trax was actually, I thought it was just a Japan-only game called Toy Sugeki Tank, because my dad bought me like one of those Chinese multi-carts.
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
you could see
Those were
everywhere.
ubiquitous back then.
I know. He bought me one with like 28 games on it or something. It was called like the 28-in-1 Super Game Boy something. And he got it at some market. And it had this game on there, called Toy Sugeki Tank. And I like, and even though that cartridge had like Super Mario Brothers and Contra and a bunch of other stuff, that was the game I kept coming back to over and over. And I would go through life being like, did you ever play Toy Sugeki Tank? And I would be like, what the hell are you talking about? What is that? And I didn't find out till I was like in college that it was called Trax in the US, and people still didn't know about it because that's a terrible title.
Yeah.
Why didn't you just call it like
CKS or Trax with an X?
TRAX? Like, what a dumb
even worse
title. Yeah, like you could have called it like Mini Tank.
Yeah, and I had never played this, and I just looked up the cover art isn't particularly great either. It's like,
no,
what if a tank but all made of bubbles?
Which to be fair is what the tank looks like, but as a sprite it makes more sense than just to draw that on the screen. I don't know.
Yeah.
The game's great though. Everyone should play Trax. You can finish it seriously in like half an hour. I think that you could probably beat it in your first sitting, honestly. It's not like the hardest game in the world, but it's just a lot of fun. And
yeah, this looks like a ton of fun. I've never played this before. Does it play sort of like a shooter, or like, I don't know. It's a little hard to, I guess it
plays like a shooter. Yeah.
It plays top down. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. It's top down. It plays like a shmup, but you're on the ground and you're driving around a tank and rotating your turret. And when I say tank, I think people think like, slow moving. It's not a slow game at all. It plays, like I said, like a shmup, but almost like a cute 'em up, like closer to like, like something like Twin Bee or Parodius or something. It has that kind of vibe to it. But it's great. That is the Game Boy game that I just cannot stop recommending to people because it is just excellent. It's not the cheapest one. I had to buy my copy for like $35 or something, but once again, you can just go download a ROM. I mean, who cares?
Yeah. Who cares?
But yeah, it's called Trax. What a stupid title.
Honestly, I had never heard of this game until you just mentioned it, and now I can't wait to go check it out. So that's very,
looks
very
adorable.
Cool. Yeah,
it's very good.
Well, here towards the end of the show, we like to do a little segment we call What's Making Us Happy This Week. And Jordan, thank you so much for joining us here. Maybe you'd like to go first. What's making you happy this week? Yeah, so it was kind of hard for me to think because I haven't been checking out a lot of the more recent media and things. You have a baby. You're I have a baby, and now I have things right now. I have a baby and a newly popular Twitter account that's eating my life. So that's all I've been doing for the most part. But when I have been hanging out with my baby and I want something quiet to unwind, I've been reading a manga, actually, called Delicious in Dungeon. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. Yes. It's extremely good. It's extremely wholesome. I just love it with all of my heart. So it's a manga about adventurers in a fantasy setting who are trying to explore this dungeon. It's a very Dungeons and Dragons style look to everything, but also like very sweet. And something about it just has like I want to go hang out with these people and give them a hug. Like something about the whole vibe is just very fun and sweet. But anyway, the biggest problem with this dungeon is it's hard to bring enough food to explore the dungeon. They meet up with this weird dwarf in the dungeon who starts teaching them how to actually cook and eat the monsters that they're fighting. And so it actually turns into this like amazing food porn, like fantasy story about like cooking dragons and like making these dishes out of, slimes in a dungeon. It's really, really great. And it's like written in this really awesome style where just like you can read a chapter and set it down. It's not like a super like there's not like a big twist and it's not like you're hanging on the edge of your seat. It's just a great thing. It's not like pick up shonen. There's no no one's talking about their power levels. Yeah. And it's not like a brand new thing. It's been around for a few years, but it's new to me. And it's just been like, it's just great. It's just awesome. And it makes me, I just got vaccinated recently. So it just makes me like really excited to hang out with my friends. I just miss hanging out with my friends. And I'm like, this makes me feel like I'm hanging out with my friends. So it's called Delicious in Dungeon. You can find it, I don't know, anywhere. It's on one of those apps. I think it's on the Shonen Jump app, or I might be mistaken. I don't know. Anyway, it's out there. Look it up. I agree. Yes. I've read the first 2 volumes of that, and it's I haven't gone back to it since then, but it's really charming. And I think the thing that like it's hard to understand about it without getting into it, is like it really is like 50% about cooking. Like they spend a couple of pages killing like a mushroom man, and then they decide they're going to cook that mushroom man into a soup, and then it's just about making mushroom soup with like slight variations on it about like, well, what if the mushroom had been a person? Like that's the
and when you turn that page and like you see the big reveal of the dish, you're just like, oh dear Lord, I'm so hungry. Like if you ever see like,
it always looks so delicious.
Like if you've ever seen like Studio Ghibli movies, all the food looks like it's from Studio Ghibli movies.
It does.
And I guess apparently it's getting an anime adaptation like next year or something. So I'm pretty excited. I think it's probably going to be really popular here in the next couple of years. So
yeah, that sounds like a vibe.
It's great.
That sounds great.
That's what's making me happy. Highly recommended.
Awesome.
Especially if you're like a Dragon Quest fan or something, you'll really dig it.
Well, not to go too full weeb on the show, but my thing that I was going to say was making me happy this week is also a Japanese thing. To set this up a little bit, I need to explain for folks who may not remember. I'm kind of obsessed with a particular arcade game called City Connection. Have been for years.
Hell yeah!
Yes, you are.
Yeah. We love a Jalico stand.
Oh yeah, hell yeah, man! So I've got a big City Connection collection. I've got obviously got the NES game, which was my first introduction to it, but the arcade game is also excellent. I've got the Famicom release. I've got an original arcade board. I've got the sort of rare, like low budget Japanese Windows PC release. I've got
Raygan. I think I need to break the news to you. Did you know that there is a pseudo spinoff of City Connection for the Nintendo Game Boy?
Wait, which one?
It's called Banishing Racer, and it's for the Game Boy. It was Japan only, but there is a fan translation, and it is an action platformer, not like City Connection, but it basically stars the same car, and it's similar to City Connection.
Okay, this is news to me, and I'm gonna have to go get it.
Light on Reagan's face.
I mean, I'm serious. Like, I'm on a quest to own every single published or released version of this game. So, like, in the last year,
this makes me so happy. This makes me so happy to hear that there is someone out there who loves City Connection.
I love
this
it.
much.
I love it. And I've got a Spanish, as in from Spain, MSX cassette release of the game.
Holy hell!
And I just found on eBay, the first time it's popped up, I've got all kinds of alerts about City Connection. Let me tell you, I've just purchased. It hasn't actually arrived yet. The German, no, maybe I'm not actually. I think it's the text is in German, but I think it actually might have been published in like the Netherlands or something. But anyway, an alternate MSX tape cassette release of the game. So and I've also got it's a part of a re-release package for it was like called the Jalico collection on the PlayStation. And I've got there's one other one other version of the game I'm not thinking of. But anyway, the only version that I still covet and don't have there was a Japan only Game Boy Advance Jalico collection that was mostly Ninja Jaja Maru-kun games, but has City Connection on it on the Game Boy Advance. And it is so rare. Every time it comes up on eBay, it is over $200 for this cartridge. And I just can't do it. Cause it's like, it's like the NES game on a re-release GBA cart with some Jaja Maru-kun stuff. I can't justify it. But anyway,
it's extremely good.
But what specifically made me happy this week was that, another bit of backstory is that obviously that was a Jalico game, but the Jalico went out of business and their rights went to a company called like PCE something or other, and then they went out of business. And long story short, a small indie developer in Japan picked up the rights to the entire Jalico catalog and now owns them and licenses them for various things and renamed themselves. I don't actually know what they were named before that, but now this indie developer is named City Connection.
I remember hearing something about this on Twitter, but I didn't.
And awesome. City Connection runs two things. They run an indie video game development studio. They've put out a few things that are mostly okay. A lot of them are like re-releases and stuff. And they run a music label, and which is called Clarice Disc. Clarice is the main character of City Connection, and Clarice Disc finally I finished setting this up. We've gotten around to what was making me happy this week. This month, Clarice Disc released an album. I'm holding it up to the camera now, but I'll have to put details into the show notes, called Mirai Connection, City Connection Remixies. And it, first of all, is the first physical City Connection thing released in at least a decade.
Holy shit, this is the coolest thing I've ever heard.
But it's a 7-song EP that features remixed versions of the music from City Connection. I'll go on another tangent because I'm such a nerd about City Connection. The music of City Connection is remixes of a Tchaikovsky piece. I'm into it. There's several levels, and each one of them features a remix of this Tchaikovsky piano piece in a sort of chiptune style, imitating various different world music styles. So like there's a rock and roll version in the New York level, and like a Britishy version in the Britain level, that kind of thing. It's great. But anyway,
I'm just losing my mind that Raygan is like the world's biggest city, like the game about the car, the game where the car
can jump, where the car can jump.
The game with the jumping car. This is not the first time that Raygan has discussed City Connection. Did we do a whole episode on it?
No, I've never been able to manage that one. I've never been able to manage to get you guys to do an episode on City Connection.
We did a
You call me when the City Connection episode is happening.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm very excited about this. I will drop a little bit of one of these songs into the show, but like they hired some J-pop singers and they are singing along to the City Connection music, and it's great.
God, this rules. Oh my gosh. That's incredible.
So that's what made me very, very happy this week. Is the songs are actually good, but what's mostly made me happy about it is like this thing that I love and am incredibly passionate about. It's very, very nice to know that somewhere in Japan there's somebody who is passionate enough about it also that they named their company City Connection, and they're continuing to care. Someone out there other than me cares about City Connection.
I'm going to change my what's making me happy to this conversation about Raygan loving City Connection.
Oh, but by the way, getting a CD shipped from Japan, Japanese CDs are expensive as hell, and getting them shipped here is even more expensive. So I paid $40-something for this 7-song EP, which is ridiculous. But okay, that's all I have to say about that.
It's okay. Like 2 years ago, I paid maybe $30 for a it's like Oh Yeah Yeah. It's like the Korean pop music from the 1960s. Like there was a compilation CD that I paid way too much to get sent to me from Korea, so I can believe it. It's great.
To be fair, that sounds cool as hell. So
it's very good music. If you want to find Korean girl groups from 1960s and 70s, I can help you out there. So I didn't expect that I would have the least weeby recommendation with a young adult fantasy series, but here we go.
All right, bring it on.
So I have a habit of when I hear from any source, I like stick a book into my not overdue, but my Libby app, which is the library app that you borrow books from, and I just put it on my tag, and if it comes up, it comes up. And this, I'll have like 50 books in the queue. I'll cycle through, and The Thief came up, and I didn't remember if this was a moody science fiction book, if this was a light little poppy thing. I just was like, well, it's up in the queue. Let's read it. It is a series where you have Jen, who is a thief who's been put in jail because he bragged about stealing something from basically the king's vizier. And the vizier takes him out of jail and is like, so you think you're the best thief? We're going to go on a quest to go steal something in another country, and I'm picking you because you won't cause diplomatic issues if you get caught or die. Like, no one will care. So the first book is all this buddy adventure. You realize there's a ton of political intrigue. It's basically fake ancient Greece. There's a whole intricate god and religion system. The heist is very good because it's one person, but the tomb is an intricate Zelda puzzle thing. I finished the first book, and then I put the other three immediately on the list. And I think I finished the first book February 28th, and I finished the fourth book March 23rd. So, like, I gobbled these up. They're short, they're sweet. All of them are really interesting. They've got the political intrigue is super interesting about this war between Anatolia, Solus, and the third country that I'm blanking on, Edis, the one in the middle.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, naturally. Of course.
Yes.
Yeah, I understand.
So I'm talking around it because the whole first book is a trick because everybody is someone else. So you're reading this book and then there's like, oh, man, you were actually this person the whole time and you were this person. I love an Ocean's 11 style heist in a book because you can't see people. And so you can't be like, aha, you were actually this other person. Anyway, if you actually are in the YA space, this is not a surprise to you. The first book, The Thief, got a Newbery Honor Award, I think. But I was fascinated by how interesting and complex these were, especially if you're an adult. And you will gobble them up like candy and feel like a smart person at the same time. And there's not a lot of books that let you do that. I think that...
Especially young adult novels, man. That's
well,
great.
I think often the political intrigue is this person is bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this one's like, oh, this person's actually secretly working with a third-party ambassador, and they're trying to overtake. And, oh, wait, also this impacts where the army's moving. There's all these moving parts, but because it's YA, it's all communicated through interesting, like, back chamber things. Also, because the main character is a thief, you get a lot of eavesdrop conversations. You get him doing these incredible stunts of, like, you know, leaning off of the top of roofs and, like, finding hidden tunnels and escaping up fireplaces. It blends about 4 different genres together in this really delightful package. So that's The Queen's Thief Theory by Megan Whalen Turner.
That's awesome.
Awesome.
That's great.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Easy reading, no matter where you are in the pandemic mindset.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, thank you, Jordan, for coming on the show. This was super fun, and love to have you.
It was an absolute pleasure. Loved being on. Absolute pleasure. I would do it anytime.
Yeah. And for folks who may be interested in the sort of, so Jordan and I are both interested in the like retro techie side of things. Jordan and I also recorded a quick episode about the Mister Project, which I've already talked about on the show a couple of places. The very exciting retro tech hardware project that I'm very excited by.
You say we recorded an episode. Really, you just talked at me and I just asked a bunch of questions because I was clueless as to how this worked.
Yeah,
but...
that was essentially what happened. Was Jordan was thinking about buying one of these things, and I was like, and we got on a call to talk about it, and I was like, let's record this for content.
Let's record this.
So that'll be somewhere, someplace eventually if you want to listen to it. And Jordan, where can people find your podcast and all the other things you do?
So you can find Pocketoid anywhere that good podcasts are found. We're pretty much on everything. You can follow me on Twitter at Jackal27 or at CRT Pixels if you're into old fat televisions and the way that old games look on them. That's about it. Those are my internet spaces. And
I want to specifically recommend people do check out Pocketoid if you haven't. It's a really well done podcast. They've been doing it a long time, and I guess they've gotten, they figured some of that stuff out. But specifically what I love about Pocketoid is that it is a sort of like news-ish podcast, in that like they cover like what's happening in like recent, like in contrast to our podcast where we tend to cover like old ass shit.
I tried that for like a week.
Yeah. They make an attempt to be topical while also not being the kind of podcast that like a lot of those podcasts. I don't know. I'm not doing a very good job of selling your show here. I apologize, but what I want to get at
if there was a box quote that I could pull from the sentence you just said and put on the box of our podcast, it would be, they make an attempt. And that's about the most I can say about it.
It's good. It's a good show. And so if you want a show that like is fun while also still telling you what happened on the most recent Nintendo Direct, basically is the vibe.
Yeah.
It is a very good show for that.
Our goal is to just help make people aware of cool video games and also just hang out because we're two best friends and it's like our excuse to talk to each other about cool video games. So if you want to hear us react to whatever weird, stupid things are happening in the game industry and also maybe find out about cool games, especially of the indie variety, you'll probably enjoy it.
Absolutely. Yeah, they do great work over there. So check that show out.
Thank you.
Our podcast, you can find, you're already listening to it, so you've found it, but you can find the rest of the information about our podcast on the internet at www.theshortgame.net, where you'll find a contact form that you can use to let us know what you think. And you can suggest games to us that way. You can also find us on Twitter at that's my one, at _shortgame. And of course, we are on Patreon. This show is supported by our listeners at patreon.com/theshortgame. And every one of our Patreon supporters, even at just $1 a month, gets instant access to our Discord, which is where we talk about the show, we plan episodes. So if you want to let us know what your favorite Game Boy games are, or let us know about I don't know, maybe you want to really tell us you want an episode on the Atari Lynx. Hop on our Discord.
Or maybe you're from Rice School Law School of Rice and you want to know where to send the bill for the IT funds.
To anyone who worked there in that era, I apologize.
Sorry.
We're very sorry. I'm pretty sure the statute of limitations is up, but anyway, those were good times. So yes, you can find us on patreon.com/theshortgame. And you can find me on Twitter at Raygan K. That's RayGanK. And Laura, where can people find you?
On Twitter at Laura J. Nash.
So my name's Jordan. You can follow me on Twitter at Jackal27. You can also follow my podcast at Pocketoid, and you can follow my personal CRT project at CRT Pixels on Twitter. If you'd like to know more about our podcast, you can find it at pocketoidpodcast.com, or you can just look us up wherever good podcasts are found.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us on this episode of The Short Game.